What is going on, guys? It is WrestleGamia here, back with another video. Now, we're going to take a break from official WWE wrestling games or other official wrestling licensed games to bring you something a little new today. We may have discussed this one briefly on a couple of other videos, but it really deserves its own deep dive here. It's regarded by many as not only the worst wrestling video game of all time, but one of the worst video games in general. Why is that? What went so horribly? Could it have been salvaged? Well, we'll answer all these questions and more in a moment, but just before that, be sure to subscribe and click on that notification bell, because today we're looking at why The Simpsons Wrestling is considered the worst wrestling video game ever. The Simpsons Wrestling was the marriage of two of your favourite things together at last, something which you never realised you needed to see combined, and after you played it, you probably realised they should never be combined ever again. It was released in 2001, just before the wrestling bubble burst and The Simpsons ratings started to decline, with it slipping into full self-parody mode. Now, we're not going to say that this game was responsible for both shows' respective ratings going down, but it says a lot about officially licensed games, that they'll do just about anything for a quick buck. WWE are kind of selling the dirt from the Boneyard match, so yeah, things could get worse, but anyway. It was developed by Big 8 Productions and published by EA, which should immediately send alarm bells ringing for many of you given their history with beloved franchises, Star Wars, and was released exclusively for PlayStation, with Europe getting the initial release in March of 2001 and North America following a month later, though by this point we're pretty sure Europe had already sent warnings across the Atlantic to stay away from this one. Of course, with any fighting game or wrestling game, there are a slew of different characters to choose from. In this game, there are 20 different characters from Springfield that make up the game's roster, including old favourites like Homer and Bart, all the way down to slightly more obscure ones like Professor Frink and Bumblebee Man. There are also some extra unlockable characters for those willing to suffer through it, like Ned Flanders, Mo Sizlak, and even Mr. Burns, the latter of which appears as a boss character later on in the game. By the way, what was up with Ned Flanders? He was overpowered as f***. Now, at least all of these are voiced by the show's real voice actors, and the matches take place at various Springfield locations such as the Quickie Mart, Moe's Tavern, or the Nuclear Power Plant. Kinda harkens back to those good old days of WWF games where they kinda took gimmicks from their character and wrestled in a similar environment, that being in WWF In Your House. Characters even have their own unique finishing moves, much in the style of a professional wrestling game, and news anchor Kent Brockman provides commentary over the proceedings, which at the very least is better than listening to more of the awful Michael Cole soundbites that can be found in the WWE 2K series. Now, you may be wondering, it doesn't sound that bad, does it? Well, so far it doesn't, and in fact it actually sounds kind of fun. After all, The Simpsons has put out some pretty weird and wonderful games in the past, including the likes of Bart vs. the Space Mutants for the original Nintendo. That was pretty decent for what it was back in the day. Unfortunately, the show also has a history of putting out some pretty terrible merchandise that we'd all like to try and forget. This is something that's even been joked about on the show itself in the episode Flaming Moe's. And WWE is no stranger to putting out some terrible merchandise over the years too, and this was doubly true during the Attitude Era, so this game kinda comes off as the worst that both had to offer. Now obviously this is not licensed by WWE, but it's something that relates to wrestling at the time. Both the WWF and WCW would sell just about anything. But here's when things start to fall apart pretty quickly, as we now get onto its atrocious gameplay. Now, it's more of a beat-em-up style game than a wrestling game in truth, with it playing more similarly to the likes of Virtua Fighter or Battle Arena Toshinden, though obviously much worse. There are two modes, tournament-style single-player fights or grudge matches, and these matches are fought over 3 rounds, which is the first sign that the developers probably hadn't watched a wrestling match in the last 50 years or so, as no one was doing rounds in the wrestling world outside of the infamous Brawl for All tournament. There's already enough rubbish to talk about in this video, so let's not focus too much on that here. And during these fights, giant letters will float around the ring. If your character is able to collect enough of them, they will be able to do a taunt and become temporarily invincible. Your health meter can also be replenished by picking up dropped food items scattered around the ring, and this is a move that suggests EA had been playing a lot of WWF In Your House or the WrestleMania arcade game, and took the Looney Tunes style that the title was going for and incorporated it into their game. The problem with that is that while WrestleMania and In Your House were fun games for what they were, albeit bizarre, this one wildly misses the mark and has all the weirdness without any of the playability, or fun for that matter. Rounds end when one wrestler drains the other's health meter and pins them for the 3 count, with 2 rounds being needed to win the match of course. Though here comes another major flaw. You don't have to be lying on your back to be pinned. In fact, you can be pinned while laying on your stomach in a decision so bizarre we're not even sure what the hell they were thinking. Again, had they even watched a wrestling match before producing this game? At least former WWE Women's star Cameron was probably a fan of this one, given the fact that she infamously did this on WWE television only to be scolded by the referee to turn their opponent on her back. It's also noteworthy here that there's no referee in the ring during the matches, so characters have to make the count themselves. There's also a stun meter that comes into play and affects what moves you will be able to do at any given time, but it's also so inconsequential it's not even worth going into detail about. Now, long story short, this game is terrible in every respect. There's nothing redeemable about this game. There really is nothing to any given fight, as your character only really gets used to ground attacks such as punches for Homer or swinging a rake for groundskeeper Willie, as well as the previously mentioned special move which requires a full stamina bar to pull off. You can also grapple your opponent, however this only allows you to Irish whip them into the ropes. There's no headlocks, takedowns or suplexes, no dropkicks or clotheslines. There's really nothing here that you would expect to find in even the most basic of wrestling games. Hell, you could even go all the way back to WWF WrestleMania for the Nintendo Entertainment System and you'll find more wrestling moves in that. You can jump from the top rope, but only to bounce up and down on your opponent's head. Come on guys, even Kevin Nash had a more varied moveset than this, that being a total of 5. But this game was released in 2001, we hear you say, back when hardcore wrestling was arguably at its peak. Surely if the game doesn't have any real wrestling fight mechanics, then can it at least cover for this with some good old plunder fighting? Well, you'd be wrong there, because not only can you not use any weapons, you can't even leave the ring. Basically, the gameplay boils down to punching your opponent enough times so their health bar drops down to nothing, then covering them for the pin. As you can probably tell from this description, this doesn't make for a very fun game to play. There's no challenge, no strategy, no variety. Even 2K20, for all its flaws, it at least had gameplay. The graphics don't even fare much better either. Compared to other titles of the day like SmackDown 2 Know Your Role, they're disappointing at best. Now the characters do look like their cartoon counterparts, but the attempt to render it in 3D is jarring and off-putting to look at, and the crowd end up looking like cardboard cutouts as they're rendered in 2D. This really is the definition of a poor licensed cash grab, and it seems like absolutely no love or effort was put into it. However, if there's one positive we could say about it, it would be the decision to have the show's real voice actors included in the game. Now, for its many flaws, it's nice to hear the likes of Dan Castellaneta and Harry Shearer provide their voicing talents, as they always bring their A-game to these projects. Seriously, even if you watch the newer episodes of The Simpsons where the quality has dropped to such a point it can barely even be considered the same show anymore, the voice actors still always knock it out of the park. This, however, just isn't enough. In every other aspect, the game is an abomination and a stain on both the names of The Simpsons and wrestling itself. It's rightly gone down as one of the worst games of all time, something which reviews at the time reflected. Metacritic ranks it 32 out of 100, with GameRanking giving it an aggregate score of 41.21%. But reviews get even worse, with IGN giving it 1 out of 10, and Gameformer 2 out of 10. The unanimously negative reviews at the time focused on the game's poor gameplay, graphics and overall budget feel, with IGN's review describing it as one of the ugliest games they had ever seen, with choppy looking graphics and character outlines that looked broken up. Additionally, Game Informer went as far as to criticize it for not holding any wrestling qualities at all, saying that instead of grappling or performing devastating slams, you could only slap your opponent silly by mashing buttons redundantly. Now, The Simpsons Wrestling ended up appearing on various worst of lists, though despite all this and against all odds, it managed to sell pretty decently, going gold and shifting at least 200,000 copies in the UK alone, though this could probably be attributed to the power of the Simpsons brand and the popularity of wrestling at the time. It's worth noting that none of the parties involved ever tried anything like this again. In fact, not only there was never another Simpsons wrestling game, but this was the only Simpsons game ever released on the PlayStation, suggesting this one might have poisoned the world somewhat. The best way to describe this one is that it's not a Simpsons wrestling game, it is instead a Simpsons game with wrestling inspiration, and not even a good one at that. Could it have worked? maybe if some actual effort and thought had been put into the development, but if we know anything about EA, they love to pump out material that will sell to those who recognize the license instead of actually working with developers to make a good game. Will it ever happen again? It's unlikely, as while The Simpsons is still hugely popular and wrestling does have a strong core audience, the zeitgeist for both has long since passed, and there doesn't seem to be anything to gain from trying to combine the two worlds again, even if they could make a good game out of it this time. Okay, here's the big one. Is it the worst wrestling game ever? Now we're gonna say yes on this one, purely because for all the flaws of modern wrestling games at least, they are that. Wrestling games. This is such an embarrassment that we reckon all parties would happily wipe this one from their memory if they could. But there you have it guys, why Simpsons Wrestling is considered the worst wrestling video game ever. Did you guys ever play this one when you were young? What did you really think of it? Let us know in the comments down below, subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling video game content.